This next lesson is going to focus solely on subtracting mixed numbers. So last time we worked on adding and subtracting mixed numbers and we had to do some regrouping. We're going to take a look at what regrouping looks like when we're subtracting mixed numbers and what we have to do when some of our fractions don't align correctly. So when we're subtracting with remaining, if the fraction in the larger mixed number is smaller than the fraction in the smaller mixed number, renaming must happen by borrowing from the whole. So that sounds like a lot, but let's take a look at what a subtraction problem looks like and what we have to do if that's the case with maybe the ones, tens, or hundreds place. So in this problem, 34 minus 15, we notice that the ones place of 5 is greater than our larger numbers ones place of 4. So what we have to do is we have to borrow from our neighbor. In this case, it's our tens place, and that becomes a 2. And then our 4 would change to a 14, and then we can subtract. When we're borrowing, in this case, we're borrowing 10, and we're bringing that 10 over so that we can subtract, and then we subtract down, and we subtract down, and we're left with 19. When we're borrowing for our mixed numbers, we're not going to be borrowing 10. Instead, we're going to be borrowing a whole because fractions are less than a whole. So let's take a look at our problem, 5 1/3 minus 2 2/3. And I want you to look at the fractions specifically. We have a 1/3 in the numerator and a 2/3 in the denominator. And we know we cannot take 1 minus 2. That's going to give us a negative number, and we don't want to do that. So before we can subtract our fractions, and remember we always start with our fractions first, and then we work over to our whole numbers, we have to do some regrouping. We notice that we can't subtract as it is, so we're going to borrow a whole. We've talked about borrowing a whole before. So we cross out our greatest number, or our ones place, our whole number, and that's going to become a 4, and then we need to rewrite a whole over to the side of our fraction. So one whole in this case is going to be equivalent to 3/3. And we're going to add that to the fraction that's already there. When I add these two fractions together, I get 4/3. Now I can subtract because now my fraction on the top, my 4/3, is greater than my fraction on the bottom. So now I'm going to do my subtraction. I'm going to subtract 4/3 minus 2/3, and when I subtract I get 2/3. And now I can subtract 4 minus 2, and I'm left with 2, and that's my final answer. The important thing here is that we're borrowing a whole and then adding a whole to the fraction that already exists. Let's take a look at our steps. The first step we need to do is to borrow a whole from the whole number. And again, this is when our numerator of our fraction in our larger mixed number is smaller than our numerator in our fraction in the smaller mixed number. So we're going to follow our steps. The first step is to borrow a whole, and then I'm going to rename that as the number below. Then I need to convert that whole into a fraction. So my fraction whole would be equivalent to 5/5 because my denominator of my fraction is a 5. Now I need to add my fractions together, and when I do that I get 6/5. And my final step is to subtract my fractions and then subtract my whole numbers. So 6/5 minus 3/5 gives me 3/5, and 5 minus 3 gives me 2. Now you might notice when we do this, we end up, when we finish our third step, we end up with a fraction greater than 1 here. That's okay because it's just temporary. It's just there to allow us to subtract. Just like when we regroup and we end up with 14 in the ones place, like we did here, that's just a temporary way for us to be able to subtract. All right, let's look at this next problem. Now notice there is no fraction here. It's missing. So what whole could we replace there? We still have to follow our steps and borrow because there is a fraction here in our denominator, so we do need, or in our lower fraction, so we do need to fill in the fraction. We're going to borrow this, and this is going to become a 3, and we need to replace it with a whole. But what's that whole going to look like? In order for me to figure out what that whole is going to be, I'm looking at my fraction down below, and there's a 6 there, so my whole is going to be equivalent to 6/6. Because remember, we want our fractions to have the same denominators for us to be able to subtract. And now we subtract down. 6/6 minus 5/6 gives me 1/6, and 3 minus 2 gives me 1, and that's my final answer. I want you to go ahead and give this one a try. 5 2/4 minus 1 3/4. Your steps are over to the side for you to follow. So again, we look at our numerator and it's less than our numerator for our smaller mixed numbers, so we do need to do our regrouping. We borrow from our whole, we add a whole, in this case our whole is equivalent to 4/4, and we're left with 6/4. And now we can subtract. 6/4 minus 3/4 gives me 3/4, and 4 minus 1 gives me 3. And that's my final answer. All right, here are two more problems for you to work out. 3 and 5/12 minus 8/12 and 4 and 2/9 minus 1 and 7/9. Go ahead and start with our 3 and 5/12. All right, my 5 is less than my 8, so I'm going to regroup. And then I'm going to add a whole, and when I add a whole, it's going to be 12/12, which leaves me with 17/12 in my top mixed number. 17/12 is then going to be subtracted by 8/12. 17 minus 8 gives me 9/12. And then I don't have anything here in my ones place. My ones place is empty, so it's like there's a 0 there. So 2 minus 0 gives me 2. Go ahead and do our next problem. We're going to do the same thing here. We have to regroup, so our 4 is going to become a 3, and then we add a whole. And when we do that, we're left with 11/9 minus 7/9, and 11 minus 7 gives me 4/9, and then I can subtract my whole numbers. 3 minus 1 gives me 2. All right, here's a word problem for us. Miss Winters ran 3 miles on Monday and 1 2/3 miles on Wednesday. How much further did she run on Monday than Wednesday? What type of problem is this? This is going to be a subtraction problem. I see how much further did she run on Monday than Wednesday, so I'm going to subtract Monday, which is 3, from Wednesday, which is 1 2/3. So go ahead and do your subtraction. When we subtract, we notice that there is no fraction next to our 3 miles, and so we're going to need to create a fraction in order for us to be able to subtract. I'm going to borrow my whole, and then I put a whole in terms of a fraction, and I chose 3/3 because my denominator fraction my denominator of my mixed number that has a fraction associated with it is a 3. And now I can subtract. 3/3 minus 2/3 gives me 1/3, and 2 minus 1 gives me 1. So how much further did Miss Winters run on Monday than Wednesday? Miss Winters ran 1 1/3 miles further. All right, we have one more word problem to do. Our last problem says, Raphael baked a cake using 3 2/4 cup of flour and 1 3/4 cup of sugar. How much more flour was in the cake batter than sugar? Go ahead and answer that question now. In order to solve this question, we need to do some subtraction. So we're going to take our 3 2/4 cup of flour, and because we want to find how much more flour was in the cake batter than sugar, we need to subtract, and we're going to subtract our 1 3/4. And we notice that our fraction on top for our greater mixed number is smaller than our fraction on the bottom, so we have to do some regrouping. We borrow from our whole, we add a whole, and we're left with 6/4, and now we can subtract. 6/4 minus 3/4, we're left with 3/4, and 2 minus 1 is 1. So how much more flour was in the cake batter than sugar? 1 3/4 cup more flour. All right, the important steps in this lesson are that the first thing that we are doing is checking our fractions to see if we even do have to borrow from our whole. If we do have to borrow from our whole, make sure you actually borrow, and then you add a whole to the fraction side. You add your fractions together, and then you subtract your fractions first and then your whole numbers. That's how we subtract with regrouping with mixed numbers. See you tomorrow.